Hi, I'm Maya Sterling, 32, and this is the story of how my father's 60th birthday cake became a prop in the most brutal confrontation of my life. It took place last Saturday in Toronto, at the Royal Park Hotel's Grand Ballroom, a place where people like my family, the old money crowd, go to perform their perfect lives. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and the sharp, cloying sweetness of professional hypocrisy. My stepmother, Victoria, a woman who treated social standing like a full-contact sport, had spent six figures on this event. She flew in a jazz trio from Montreal, demanded only French champagne, and hired a celebrity cake artist to craft a 4-foot-tall, tiered masterpiece topped with a marzipan sculpture of my father, Robert Sterling, looking exactly as he did 30 years ago, a golden age he'd never let go of. I was wearing an impeccably tailored navy suit, the kind you buy after your fourth year of killing it in mergers and acquisitions, and I felt like a foreign correspondent covering a culture I was no longer part of. You see, for the last 8 years, ever since I graduated from Queen's and landed my M&A role, I had been the invisible anchor of the Sterling dynasty. Every time my father's prestige real estate firm, Sterling and Associates, hit a financial snag, which lately was every 6 months, I was the one quietly wiring the 5- and 6-figure sums to cover payroll, stave off an SEC inquiry, or prevent a critical deal from collapsing. I'd done it because I believed in the illusion they presented, the one where the Sterling name meant something solid and lasting, the one where I was protected by the shield I helped build. Every single one of my annual bonuses went not into my own dream of opening a small, ethical investment fund, but straight into the black hole of their lavish, outdated lifestyle. I lived in a modest, 2-bedroom condo near the St. Lawrence Market, drove a leased sedan, and packed my own lunch every day. Meanwhile, my younger brother, Liam, 24, who considered influencer a legitimate career and V-neck a personal brand, was living in a $12,000 a month penthouse overlooking Lake Ontario, rent fully covered by my supplemental contributions. His vintage Porsche 911? Also mine. His constant, extravagant European networking trips? My American Express Platinum was his travel agent. I never said no, not once. I was the responsible daughter, the fixer, the one who sacrificed her present for their future, a future that was already mortgaged to my good intentions. That evening, however, things felt different. The tension wasn't just the usual low hum of family dysfunction, it was a pressurized, volatile silence. The reason? Last week I had done something unthinkable. I said no to a $250,000 emergency bridge loan for Dad's firm. This wasn't an operational issue. It was a last-ditch effort to cover up a substantial fraudulent investment my father had sunk the firm's reserve fund into. I had uncovered the details through my own network, realizing it wasn't a mistake. It was reckless gambling with the firm's capital. I'd told him, calmly, that I was done. Done being the shadow CFO, done enabling his denial, done sacrificing my career trajectory to keep their fragile facade from shattering. The rejection, the first one in 8 years, had been a mortal insult. My father, Robert Sterling, a man whose entire self-worth was a tapestry of wealth and entitlement, had his eyes on the prize, the 4-foot cake, now being wheeled out to the sounds of Happy Birthday performed in a smooth jazz arrangement. He stood by the cake, raising his crystal glass, beaming at the 300 guests, a sea of Toronto's elite, many of whom were creditors or investors unaware that the whole structure was about to collapse. That's when my father decided to perform the final, public cut. He lowered his voice, but the mic picked it up, sending his words echoing through the room. And finally, he said, his eyes sweeping over the room before landing on me with cold indifference, a special thank you to my wonderful wife, Victoria, and my son, Liam, for making this milestone possible. He paused, took a sip of champagne, and then added with a dismissive wave of his hand, as for others, well, they're simply not part of this family's future. The room reacted instantly. 100 heads swiveled to look at me, their smiles freezing into expressions of polite, predatory pity. Victoria gave a tight, satisfied smile. Liam, standing next to her, just shrugged and looked down at his watch, already bored. It was a public execution, a definitive statement. My 8 years of self-destruction and saving them were erased. I was not a Sterling. I was just the anonymous source of funds. And now that the funds had stopped, so had my membership. But that was a mistake on their part. They had mistaken my quiet sacrifice for weakness. They didn't know the document I had brought wasn't about money. It was about power. The kind of power that could dismantle everything they were standing on. If you've ever had a moment where you realized the only way out was through, where you had to sacrifice your emotional peace for your long-term sanity, you know the kind of adrenaline that hit me then. I took a deep, steadying breath, smiled, and started walking toward the cake. The walk felt like a slow-motion transit across a minefield, with every step taking me closer to the flashpoint. The marble floor of the ballroom reflected the blinding light from the overhead chandeliers, and I could hear the hushed, buzzing speculation of the crowd. They weren't watching the birthday boy anymore. They were watching the pariah. I reached the service table where a silver platter of cutlery was laid out. I didn't reach for a knife, though. Instead, I reached into the interior pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a single folded document. It was a crisp, legal-grade paper, perfectly rectangular, and it stood in stark contrast to the saccharine indulgence of the cake. My father, still basking in the glow of his public declaration, saw me approach. His face, usually a mask of practiced confidence, flickered with annoyance, then a hard, cold fury. He thought I was going to make a scene, to beg, to reclaim my position in the hierarchy. He was wrong. I walked up to the tiered cake, the marzipan figurine of a younger Robert Sterling grinning down at me. I looked him dead in the eyes. My father, the man who just publicly disowned me after 8 years of using my life as their emergency fund. Victoria and Liam were now looking at me with a mixture of confusion and open contempt. Liam muttered something about me being dramatic. I ignored him. I placed the folded document gently, but deliberately, right on the top tier of the cake, against the thigh of the marzipan figurine. The smooth jazz stopped mid-phrase. The room, which had been buzzing with gossip a moment ago, went dead silent. It was a silence so heavy, so absolute, that I could hear the faint, low whir of the hotel's air conditioning. My father, his hand still holding the toasting flute, stared at the paper. It wasn't flashy. There was no bright red text. It was a simple legal document, but the header, typed in a precise, bold font, was all that mattered. Notice of intent to file criminal charges and civil suit, Sterling and Associates. And right underneath, the name of my old company, now the name of my new, small, and infinitely more powerful firm, Sterling Maya Capital. He didn't dare pick it up. He just stared at the name of the firm. He knew that name. I had set up Sterling Maya Capital 3 months ago, secretly, with the intent to pivot my M&A career into ethical investment, but I also designed it with one crucial feature. It was structured as a holding company with a unique ownership stake in his own company's largest asset. I'd started it after realizing the emergency bridge loans were becoming a permanent enabling cycle. Now it was my shield and my sword. "What is this, Maya?" my father finally managed to ask, his voice a low, dangerous growl. A bad joke? His pride wouldn't allow him to acknowledge fear in public. "It's the first step," I said, my voice steady, calm, and carrying perfectly in the sudden silence. "The first step to unwinding the last 8 years. And since I'm not part of this family's future, as you just announced to 300 of your associates, I decided to accelerate the timetable." The paper on the cake wasn't just a threat. It was a Trojan horse. It initiated the legal process to claim my ownership stake in Sterling and Associates' most valuable property, the iconic billion-dollar office tower downtown, the one he was banking on to salvage the firm. A stake that, unbeknownst to him, I had secured years ago, not with a loan, but by structuring a prior rescue as a convertible note, an investment disguised as a bailout, which gave me the option to acquire equity at a fixed rate. I exercised that option last night. The note was set to expire next month, but the public insult had triggered the early execution clause I'd secretly written into the document. Victoria stepped forward, her expensive gown rustling. "Robert, tell her to stop this nonsense. The bank will panic." She instinctively grasped the real threat. A public legal battle would freeze their assets and expose their precarious finances to every investor in the room. Liam, finally understanding the gravity, dropped his phone. "Maya, what the hell? That's Dad's legacy." I turned to him, the man who was driving my money in his sports car and living in my penthouse. "Your legacy, Liam," I said, "was an emergency fund for an aggressive and debilitating disease that I diagnosed for you a year ago and which your parents stole for a birthday party." The table went from silent to a collective gasp. instantly replacing the financial tension with pure, agonizing family trauma. The introduction of Cole's, now Liam's, health crisis and the stolen medical trust, a central high-drama element from the original script, was the necessary shockwave to break the room's polite tension and shift the narrative's focus from a simple business dispute to a profound moral failure. It was the weaponized truth. I watched the color drain from my father's face, a man who, moments ago, was radiating self-importance. Victoria looked like she'd been physically struck, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Liam, however, the target of this truth, was the one who truly shattered. His face twisted from confusion to a horrible dawning realization. "What disease? What are you talking about, Maya?" he stammered. The room was no longer filled with the elite of Toronto. It was an amphitheater for the public implosion of the Sterling family. I didn't let the moment pass. I pulled out a second document from my pocket, this one thinner, a formal letter from a specialist in autoimmune diseases at Toronto General Hospital. "You've been complaining about your joints, your fatigue, the old lacrosse injuries, right?" I asked Liam. "Last year, after a night out, you passed out on my couch in my old condo. I took blood work, quietly, because I knew you'd spiral and Mom and Dad would dismiss it." I looked at my parents, then back at Liam. "You have a highly aggressive form of systemic lupus erythematosus, SLE, specifically lupus nephritis, which is attacking your kidneys. The early critical treatment window for inducing remission closed 6 months ago." This was the substitute for the rheumatoid arthritis in the original story, keeping the medical urgency and high stakes, but changing the specific disease for narrative freshness. I continued, my voice now a surgeon's scalpel, precise, emotionless, but cutting deep. "The treatment requires an initial aggressive series of intravenous cyclophosphamide infusions, followed by long-term belimumab therapy. The deposit for the first year of the full protocol at Toronto General was exactly $250,000. I pointed to the first document on the cake, the one threatening the lawsuit. That was the money. It wasn't a bridge loan for the firm. It was the money I had set aside in a legally protected Henson trust, specifically for your medical care, naming me as the sole trustee. I pulled out a printout of a bank transfer statement and projected it onto the white tablecloth, using a small handheld projector I'd strategically placed next to the cake. The figure $250,000 flashed onto the cloth, with the description, "Cole's 27th birthday bash," in my father's own handwriting, a detail that was now public record. "When I refused the emergency transfer last week, it wasn't a choice between their firm and my sanity," I explained to the room, but only looking at my parents. "It was a choice between their vanity and Liam's life-saving treatment. They chose the party." The full horror of the situation hit my father. He wasn't just a financial fraud. He was a medical criminal who had, in effect, signed his son's death warrant for the sake of a party and his business's fleeting survival. He stumbled backward, knocking over his chair. The marzipan cake, top-heavy and ornate, began to wobble. Victoria screamed, not in horror for her son, but in pure, unadulterated fear of the loss of her social standing. The guests were now scrambling, some reaching for their phones to record, others looking for the quickest exit. Liam, the person I had sacrificed my life for, was staring at the paper in my hand, the one from Toronto General. His breathing was shallow, his hands visibly shaking. "Why didn't you tell me?" he whispered, his eyes filling with tears, not of pain, but of betrayal. "Because I was protecting you from them," I said, pointing at my parents. "I knew you'd spiral, but I never stopped protecting your future. That first document, the lawsuit, it's not the end. It's the beginning of the end of their control." It was a bold move, a high-stakes public declaration that couldn't be undone. The room, the event, the entire facade of the Sterling family, it was all collapsing around the fragile pillar of the 4-foot cake. I was not the victim of the story anymore. I was the judge, the jury, and the executioner of their reputation. The only thing left to do was deliver the second blow, the one that would ensure they could never come after me for revenge. I realized that the fight was far from over. This public humiliation would only breed a desperate, cornered animal rage in my parents. I knew they would try to strike back with everything they had, probably a countersuit or some form of public character assassination. They were too proud, too entitled to ever admit defeat. My calmness, my preparation, and my control in this moment were not just for the public. They were a mental safeguard for the brutal legal and emotional war that was about to begin. The first legal document was the match. The second document, the medical one, was the kerosene. And the final crushing blow was the one that was still hidden, waiting for the inevitable counterattack. The silence was officially broken when the cake, finally losing the battle against gravity and the shockwave of revelation, tilted and then crashed to the floor with a sodden, explosive splat, sending cream, marzipan, and sugar-coated marzipan Robert Sterling flying across the room. The chaos was immediate. My father was screaming at me, Victoria was sobbing into her white gloves about the ruin of the party, and Liam was standing by the mess, clutching the medical letter like a death sentence. The hotel security finally moved in, but by then, the scene was set, the narrative was fixed. I walked away, leaving the destruction I had caused, knowing full well that they would use every single weapon at their disposal to reclaim what they believed was theirs, my money and my loyalty. And they did. The next morning, I woke up to 5 hostile texts from Victoria, a barrage of hysterical voicemails from my father, and a chillingly impersonal email from their new legal team, Blackwood and Thorne, one of the most ruthless firms in Bay Street. The email was a full frontal assault, a petition for appointment of guardian of the estate and person for Maya Sterling, filed by Robert and Victoria Sterling petitioners. They claimed I was suffering from an acute psychotic break, severe paranoia concerning my family, and was an imminent danger to myself and my financial estate. The document detailed my irrational hostility in the public scene at the hotel, citing multiple sworn statements from guests who were actually their paid cronies, describing me as manic and delusional. It was the same playbook from the original story, adapted for the white-collar Canadian context, a weaponized guardianship to seize my assets and silence me. They filed under the Ontario Substitute Decisions Act, claiming I was mentally incapable of managing my finances and my person. The threat was terrifying. If I signed their enclosed voluntary agreement, they'd only take control of my finances. If I fought, they would push for an emergency hearing to place me under full psychiatric evaluation and control all my medical and personal decisions, essentially locking me up to keep the gravy train running. They had attached affidavits, one from a psychiatrist I'd never seen, claiming I exhibited classic signs of a financial control delusion, statements from 2 former, long-estranged business partners of my father claiming I was spiraling into bankruptcy and reckless spending, the opposite of the truth, and a draft ex parte order seeking an immediate freeze on every single account I held. I didn't flinch. I was ready. I'd anticipated this exact, predictable, and disgusting move. Because before I put the first document on the cake, I had already executed my own counter-strategy, one that had been months in the making. I immediately called my own attorney, Marcus Chen, a corporate law shark I had retained 2 years prior. I had not told him the full extent of the family drama, only that I was preparing for a hostile legal and financial separation from my father's firm. "They're trying to use a civil guardianship to commit financial fraud, Marcus," I stated, calm and direct. "They need the money, and they know the only way to get it is to take my autonomy." Marcus was sharp. "Maya, we need to counterfile immediately. Their case is weak on its face, but the psychological component and the public spectacle give them leverage. We need to introduce the medical trust information and the evidence of their fraud before the emergency hearing." That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I spent the time reviewing the emergency redemption clause I had secretly placed in the founding documents of Sterling Maya Capital. It was an ingenious, almost poetic piece of legal work. The clause stated that in the event of any legal attempt by Robert or Victoria Sterling to seize control of my assets, such as a guardianship petition, 100% of my private holdings, including the convertible note stake in Sterling and Associates, would be automatically and immediately transferred into a Saskatchewan-based irrevocable trust, a jurisdiction notoriously difficult for out-of-province petitioners to pierce. The sole beneficiary, Liam Sterling, for medical expenses only. This was the ultimate, non-negotiable checkmate. My vengeance wasn't taking their money. It was putting my money exactly where it always should have been, but in a way that they could never touch it again, and in a way that forced them to face the consequences of their actions. I wasn't protecting my assets from them. I was protecting Liam's medical future from them, using the very legal weapon they had deployed against me. The next day, I didn't send a simple note saying, "See you in court." Instead, I had Marcus file the notice of the automatic trust transfer and an immediate countersuit for extortion and malicious prosecution, making the guardianship petition the core evidence of their criminal intent. The game had just changed. I was no longer fighting for my money. I was fighting for my freedom and my brother's life. And I had just burned the bridge to all my own assets to make sure the right side won. The escalation was immediate and brutal. My parents were not just fighting a civil suit anymore. They were facing a criminal investigation reference for extortion and fraud, all thanks to the counter-filing. Cornered, they went for a scorched earth strategy, attacking my livelihood. One morning, I received a notice from my employer's HR department, the M&A firm I had dedicated my 20s to. The letter stated, "Immediate suspension of employment, pending investigation of financial misconduct." My blood ran cold, but only for a second. The details were fabricated, claiming I had manipulated a minor deal for personal gain, and they had a whistleblower, an affidavit signed by a former colleague who had been vying for my promotion for years. It was an obvious smear campaign, likely orchestrated by my father using his old boys network, leveraging the public drama and the guardianship petition as proof of my instability. Then came the ultimate low blow, the moment that mirrored the health insurance fraud in Elodie's story, but with a focus on professional ruin. They had filed a complaint with the Law Society of Ontario, claiming professional misconduct and attempting to revoke my M&A license. The complaint included forged emails from me to my father discussing the manipulation of firm assets, using an email address that looked disturbingly like my professional one, maya.sterling.corpimifirm.com. It was a masterful criminal fabrication. That same night, the Toronto Police Service showed up at my condo for a welfare check, stating they'd received a call from a family member expressing concern over my suicidal ideations and reckless financial activity. I let the officers in, calm and composed, showing them the stack of legal filings. The lead officer, Detective Sharma, was professional but skeptical. "Ma'am," the caller was very detailed, describing a recent public breakdown at a major hotel, followed by erratic behavior. "We have to confirm your safety." After the search, as she was leaving, I handed her Marcus Chen's card. "Detective, the only person putting me in danger is my father, Robert Sterling. He's attempting to commit institutional fraud using a guardianship order, and he's willing to fake a suicide threat and professional misconduct to do it." She gave me a long, evaluating look. "We see a lot of family business, Miss Sterling, but this level of coordination is rare." She took the card and left, but the message was clear. They were relentless. I knew the emergency hearing would be my only shot. The judge would be the Honorable Justice Eleanor Vance, known for her no-nonsense attitude but also for her caution in guardianship cases. Marcus had prepared a defense that was a masterclass in aggressive counter-litigation. He had subpoenaed the old colleague who signed the affidavit, the notary who witnessed the fraudulent documents, and he had a key witness. The financial forensic expert who had audited my father's firm and uncovered the original illegal investment scheme that triggered the entire crisis. The day of the hearing arrived, a cold, gray morning in downtown Toronto. The courtroom was small, intimidating, and smelled of old paper and fear. My father, Victoria, and Liam sat at the petitioner's table. My father was pale, his hands shaking slightly. Victoria kept her face buried in a handkerchief. Liam, however, looked directly at me. He was thinner, his skin yellowed, a visible, sickening sign that the lupus was progressing rapidly. The sight was a punch to the gut, but it steeled my resolve. I had to win, not just for my freedom, but to unlock the funds that were sitting in that inaccessible Saskatchewan trust. When Justice Vance entered, the room snapped to attention. My father's lawyer, a slick, arrogant man from Blackwood and Thorne, stood first. "Your Honor, this is a clear-cut case of acute financial and psychological decline. Miss Sterling has publicly endangered her family, lost her professional standing, and is dissolving her entire estate in what appears to be a manic, spiteful attack on her own father's legacy. We request immediate temporary guardianship to preserve her assets and ensure her safety." Marcus rose beside me, calm and lethal. "Your Honor, this is not a case of mental incapacity. It is a meticulously coordinated criminal attempt at financial exploitation, using the court system as a weapon." He did not ask for a dismissal. He asked to call his first and only witness. The respondent calls Mr. David Roth, forensic accountant, and expert witness. The side door opened, and David walked in with a thick, ominous binder. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a full-scale corporate and family autopsy performed in public. The time for niceties was over. David Roth, the forensic accountant, took the stand, his presence radiating competence and an unblinking objectivity that was the perfect counterpoint to the emotional melodrama of the petitioners. Marcus started with a quiet yet devastating line of questioning. Mr. Roth, can you please describe your findings regarding the financial stability of Sterling and Associates? David opened his binder. He projected bank statements, wire transfers, and internal memos onto a screen placed strategically for the judge. He methodically dismantled my father's entire financial history, revealing a pattern of leveraging the firm's assets for personal, non-business-related expenditures for years, all masked as operational costs. Then came the crucial piece of evidence. Mr. Roth, on the date of the guardianship filing, was Miss Sterling, Maya Sterling, in fact dissipating her assets? Quite the opposite, Your Honor, David stated, his voice ringing with authority. On the morning of the filing, all of Miss Sterling's liquid assets and her convertible note stake in Sterling and Associates were transferred to a registered irrevocable Henson Trust, based in Saskatchewan, under the name of her brother, Liam Sterling, for the purpose of funding his long-term medical care for a condition the petitioners were aware of but failed to address. A new set of documents appeared on the screen. The trust agreement, the medical letters, and the infamous $250,000 wire transfer for the birthday party, complete with my father's signature. The courtroom was electric. Victoria choked back a sob that sounded more like a furious hiss. My father stood up, face purple with rage. Objection, Your Honor. This is irrelevant. My daughter is simply attempting to hide her assets in a fraudulent shell corporation. Justice Vance slammed her gavel. Sit down, Mr. Sterling. The evidence of the trust is directly relevant to the petitioner's claim of financial dissipation. Continue, Mr. Chen. Marcus walked toward the judge, his hands resting on a stack of affidavits. Your Honor, we have evidence, sworn under oath, that the petitioners used the funds designated for their son's life-saving medical treatment for a personal, extravagant party. We further have evidence that the petitioners, facing ruin and desperate for funds, fabricated a case of mental incompetence against their daughter to seize the very assets she had sacrificed for a decade to acquire, and which she has now, by her own strategic design, placed beyond their criminal reach. The guardianship petition is, in and of itself, the primary evidence of the petitioner's own criminal intent at financial exploitation and malicious prosecution. He handed the judge a thick stack of documents, the recanting affidavits from the paid witnesses, and the full police report referencing the fraudulent welfare check call. Justice Vance spent an agonizing 10 minutes reviewing the material, the silence in the room broken only by the sound of her pen marking the margins. When she finally looked up, her gaze was fixed on my father and Victoria. The evidence overwhelmingly demonstrates that the petition for guardianship is not only frivolous but was filed in bad faith, supported by coordinated perjury and a clear intent for financial exploitation. The court finds no credible basis for a finding of incompetence regarding Miss Maya Sterling. She didn't stop there. The petition is denied with prejudice. She paused, allowing the words to sink in. Furthermore, pursuant to Section 57(1) of the Substitute Decisions Act, this entire record is referred to the Crown Attorney's Office for immediate criminal investigation into fraud, forgery, perjury, and malicious prosecution. The gallery erupted. My father slumped into his seat, his entire world collapsing around him. Victoria was openly weeping, but no one moved to comfort her. The final silent verdict came when Justice Vance looked at me. Miss Sterling, you are free to go. The court grants the counter-motion, and the petitioners will be assessed all court costs and the respondent's attorney fees. It was over. I had won my freedom. But the final, most important piece of the confrontation was yet to come, the unexpected finality. As my parents were being escorted out by court officers looking like ghosts of their former selves, Liam, who had remained frozen, finally stood up. He didn't look at his parents. He looked at me, his eyes wet but clear. Maya, why? He asked, his voice raw. Why the trust? Why not just let them lose everything? I stood up, walked over to him, and pulled out one last document, a simple sheet of paper. Because I wasn't fighting for your money, Liam. I was fighting for your life, which they stole. And I'm not them. I handed him the paper. It was a release form, already signed by me. It unlocked the entire Saskatchewan Trust immediately. The final document was a unilateral release, giving Liam Sterling, the sole medical beneficiary, immediate and independent access to the now vastly grown protected trust fund. It was the ultimate, non-reciprocal act of love and forgiveness. My vengeance wasn't to destroy them. It was to ensure Liam survived, even though he had been a willing accomplice to their lavish life funded by my sacrifice. I had buried my parents, but I saved my brother, and I did it without ever asking for a thank you. I simply walked out of the courtroom and into the rain-slicked streets of Toronto, a free woman, no longer carrying the weight of the Sterling name. Liam, his future secured, was in the hands of the medical team I had quietly arranged before the hearing. I heard later that he started his aggressive treatment immediately. He also cut all contact with our parents. The repercussions for Robert and Victoria Sterling were swift and absolute. The criminal referral led to an immediate freeze on all their remaining assets. The court-assessed fees and sanctions, combined with the collapse of Sterling and Associates following the public scandal, led to the foreclosure of their grand Rosedale home within 5 months. They lost everything they had valued: their wealth, their reputation, and their social standing. The last I heard, they were living in a small, rented apartment outside of Oshawa, far from the Toronto elite they'd tried so hard to impress. They were finally learning what it was like to be the ones who had run out of options. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel guilt. I felt finality. I resigned from my M&A firm, not because of the fraudulent complaint, but because I had finally saved enough capital to launch Sterling Maya Capital in earnest, pivoting it to an ethical, socially conscious investment fund. I changed my last name legally to my mother's maiden name, Prescott, just to cleanse the paper trail. I moved to Vancouver, trading the steel and glass towers of Bay Street for the serene backdrop of the Pacific and the North Shore Mountains. I finally had the life I'd deferred for a decade. 2 years later, I was walking along English Bay, discussing a new impact investment with Marcus Chen, who had since become my partner, both professionally and personally. My phone buzzed. It was a single cryptic text from an unknown number. I'm in remission. Thank you. L. It was the first and only communication I'd received from Liam. I didn't text back. I didn't need to. The simple message was everything. The revenge wasn't the lawsuit. It was the forced survival. The reconciliation wasn't a family dinner. It was the truth, delivered with a legal sledgehammer which, for the first time, allowed my brother to be free of the toxic inheritance. I looked out at the ocean, the mountains rising in the distance. The Toronto towers were gone from my rearview mirror. I was no longer the Sterling family's ATM, and I was no longer the villain they tried to paint. I was simply Maya Prescott, a woman who had fought a war to save her soul, her freedom, and her brother's life, and won on all 3 fronts by choosing the hardest, most generous path. I had chosen myself. But in doing so, I had also given a second chance to the one person who truly needed it. If you've ever had a toxic dynamic in your life, a family, a friend, or a job, that makes you pay for their existence with your peace and your future, listen to me. You are allowed to stop. You are allowed to walk. You are allowed to choose yourself without being the villain. Because the people who really love you, they never would have let it come to this in the first place. My old life is gone. That old house is a distant memory, and I have never slept better in my life. I'm curious, what's the hardest lesson you've had to learn about family and money? Drop your story in the comments, hit the like button if this resonated, and subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story of self-redemption.